Roberto Troncarelli, president of Italy's National Council of Geologists, the institution responsible for professional geological standards across an entire nation, assessed the Niscemi landslide and delivered a verdict that departed from the careful language officials typically employ. No technical solutions can guarantee definitive stabilization. Not difficult to stabilize, not expensive to stabilize. No solution exists. The head of Italy's geological profession describing a failure that engineering cannot fix. As we covered in our previous video on January 25, 2026, over 1,800 residents of Niscemi, Sicily, were evacuated as a landslide front stretching 4 kilometers began advancing toward the town center. Families fled Sunday lunch with 4 minutes warning. The scarp, the vertical cliff where the ground tore itself apart, now stands over 20 meters high. That is a 6-story building of raw exposed earth, and it is still moving. But here is what most coverage has missed. This is not a normal landslide, not a shallow slope failure that drainage and retaining walls can fix. What is happening beneath Niscemi is something far more serious. A frana composita, a composite landslide, with failure surfaces reaching 30 to 35 meters underground. Deeper than a 10-story building is tall. An ancient landslide body, dormant for decades, that has reactivated and begun consuming the town from below. To understand why Italy's top geologists are using words like impossible and no solution, you need to understand what a deep-seated composite failure actually is, and why the physics make this landslide fundamentally different from anything standard engineering can address. Most landslides are manageable. Most landslides can be stopped. Niscemi is neither. When most people picture a landslide, they imagine a shallow failure. Soil and debris sliding down a slope after heavy rain. These failures typically involve the top few meters of material. They move along relatively simple surfaces, and critically, they respond to standard engineering interventions. Shallow landslides can be stabilized with retaining walls that reach below the failure surface. They can be mitigated with drainage systems that remove the water driving the movement. They can be prevented by regrading, cutting back the slope to a gentler angle. Engineering has developed proven techniques for these failures over centuries of practice. Build a wall deep enough, drain the water fast enough, reshape the slope gently enough, and the movement stops. This is not what is happening in Niscemi. The University of Turin's Department of Earth Sciences has classified the Niscemi failure as a frana composita, a composite landslide. This classification changes everything. A composite landslide involves multiple failure mechanisms operating simultaneously at different depths. In Niscemi's case, rotational sliding in the upper portion near the town, and deep translational sliding in clay layers 30 to 35 meters below the surface. Unlike shallow failures that can be anchored with walls, Niscemi's slip surface extends deeper than a 10-story building. Unlike simple slides that drain in weeks, Niscemi's critical water pressures are building in clay that takes years to depressurize. Unlike localized failures that affect a hillside, Niscemi's front stretches 4 kilometers. The distinction between shallow and deep-seated failure is not academic. It determines whether engineering can help. And at Niscemi's depth, at Niscemi's scale, with Niscemi's mechanism, the answer from Italy's leading geologists has been unambiguous. It cannot. The failure surface beneath Niscemi is not flat, it is curved. And that curve is why the landslide keeps eating backward into the town. Geologists describe Niscemi's upper failure as scivolamento rotazionale, rotational sliding. The term sounds technical, but the geometry is intuitive. Imagine scooping ice cream with a spoon. The spoon's curved bowl is the shape of a rotational slip surface. Material does not slide straight down. It rotates backward along that curve, tilting as it moves. This is exactly what is happening beneath Niscemi's western neighborhoods. The ground is not simply dropping. It is rotating backward along a curved failure surface that extends 30 to 35 meters underground, deeper than a 10-story building is tall. This rotation creates a distinctive pattern that geologists recognize immediately. A near-vertical scarp at the top where the ground has pulled away, and a tilted, back-rotated mass below where buildings now lean at angles that defy their foundations. The rotation creates what geologists call basculamento, back-tilting. As the mass rotates along the curved slip surface, the top of the block tips backward while the toe pushes forward. This is why residents reported seeing intact houses drifting toward the valley. The buildings were riding on a rotating block, moving as passengers on a geological conveyor belt they could not see and could not stop. But the rotation is only half the story. Below the curved upper failure in clay layers 30 to 35 meters deep, the mechanism shifts. Here, the failure becomes planar, a massive slab sliding along a nearly horizontal surface where saturated clay has lost its strength. This deep translational component is what gives the landslide its enormous scale and terrifying momentum. The University of Turin's Department of Earth Sciences, one of Italy's leading geological research institutions, describes the overall geometry as rototraslativo, roto-translational. Rotation above, translation below, combined into a single catastrophic system that standard engineering cannot address. Here is where the physics becomes truly alarming. The mechanism described creates what geologists call arretramento della corona, retrogression of the crown, or headscarp retreat. Each rotation removes support from the material behind it. Each collapse enables the next. The failure is self-feeding. Think of it like dominoes, but in reverse. When the front of the landslide moves, it removes the buttressing support that was holding the material behind it in place. That material then becomes unstable and fails, removing support from the material behind it, triggering a chain reaction that propagates backward, upslope, toward the town center. Unlike a normal landslide that happens once and stops, a retrogressive failure continues until the slope reaches a stable geometry, and that geometry is nowhere close to current conditions. This is why the red zone keeps expanding. This is why evacuations keep growing. The landslide is not a single event that happened on January 25th. It is an ongoing process of retrogressive failure that will continue until physics allows it to stop. Perhaps most alarming is what experts have identified about the nature of this failure. This is not a new landslide. It is described as frana antica reattivata, an ancient landslide that has reactivated. The slip surfaces the current movement is exploiting are not fresh breaks in stable rock. They are pre-existing weaknesses in the geology, planes of failure that have moved before, possibly centuries ago, that have now been reactivated by water infiltration. An ancient slide body, dormant for generations, awakened by a single storm. The clay layers that failed before are failing again. The geometry that collapsed before is collapsing again. Niscemi is not experiencing a new disaster. It is experiencing the return of an old one. Niscemi is built on a geological time bomb, permeable sand sitting on impermeable clay. When water fills the sand, the clay beneath transforms from stable foundation into sliding surface. The stratigraphy beneath Niscemi follows a pattern that geologists recognize as inherently dangerous. Multiple sources, the University of Turin, the National Council of Geologists, regional geological surveys, all describe the same layered structure, poorly consolidated sands and sandstones sitting on top of thick clay layers. This is what experts call a permeability contrast, and it is the reason Niscemi's hillside was never truly stable. The upper sandy layers allow water to infiltrate easily. Rain soaks in, percolates downward, moves through the spaces between particles like water through a sieve. But when that water reaches the clay layers below, it stops. Clay is effectively impermeable on human timescales. Water cannot drain through it. It accumulates at the interface, pooling above the clay like water collecting on a sheet of glass. Roberto Troncarelli, president of the National Council of Geologists, described this exact configuration: a sandy plateau sitting over impermeable clays. It is a structure that favors large, rototranslational slides whenever water pressures build. What happens next is the physical mechanism that triggers failure. As water accumulates above and within the clay layers, it builds what geologists call pressioni interstiziali, pore water pressure. This is the pressure exerted by water trapped in the spaces between soil particles. The physics is straightforward but devastating. Soil strength depends on particles pressing against each other, creating friction that resists sliding. When water pressure builds in those spaces, it pushes particles apart, reducing the contact forces between them. Less contact means less friction. Less friction means less strength. Eventually, strength drops below the threshold needed to hold the slope in place, and the clay begins to slide. The University of Turin describes this as the critical mechanism at Niscemi. Clay layers saturate, lose shear resistance, and begin sliding along pre-existing slip surfaces. The water does not simply lubricate the failure, it fundamentally changes the mechanical properties of the clay, transforming material that held buildings for centuries into material that cannot hold itself. The trigger for Niscemi's reactivation was Cyclone Harry, which delivered extraordinary rainfall to Sicily in mid-January 2026. The water infiltrated through the sandy upper layers, accumulated at the clay interface, and raised pore pressures past the threshold where ancient slip surfaces reactivated. The geological trap was set millions of years ago. The storm simply sprung it. The numbers from Niscemi are not just large. They are in a category that makes standard engineering responses physically impossible. Ray News, citing prior geological investigations and monitoring data, reports that the slip surfaces beneath Niscemi reached depths of 30 to 35 meters. To visualize that depth, a typical 10-story building stands roughly 30 meters tall. The failure surface beneath Niscemi extends deeper than a 10-story building is high. Any engineering intervention, any retaining wall, any foundation, any structural support would need to reach below that depth to have any effect on the sliding mass. At 35 meters, you are not building a wall. You are attempting to anchor into geology that is itself in motion. The landslide front stretches approximately 4 kilometers. That is roughly 2.5 miles. 50 soccer fields laid end to end. This is not a localized slope failure affecting a single hillside or a few homes. It is a regional geological event affecting an entire flank of the town. The scarp, the vertical cliff where the ground has separated, stands over 20 meters high in places. That is a 6-story building of raw, exposed earth, yellow sand above gray clay, marking the boundary between ground that has moved and ground that has not yet moved. The color contrast visible in drone footage tells the geological story. Permeable sand above, impermeable clay below, the interface where failure initiates. Now here is the number that transforms this landslide from a disaster into a mathematical certainty. Every granular material has what geologists call an angle of repose, the steepest angle at which it can maintain a stable slope. Think of pouring sand onto a table. The pile forms a cone that never gets steeper than a specific angle. Pour more sand, the cone spreads wider, but the angle stays the same. Physics will not allow it to be steeper. For sandy materials like those exposed in Niscemi's scarp, that stable angle is typically 30 to 35 degrees. The University of Turin expects the scarp to eventually stabilize at an angle between 30 and 45 degrees, the natural resting angle for the exposed sandy material. But the current scarp face is standing near vertical. That gap between current angle and stable angle is not a prediction. It is arithmetic. The scarp must retreat. The landslide must advance. The material standing at angles far steeper than it can sustain will continue collapsing until physics allows it to stop. No intervention changes this math. No engineering accelerates the timeline. The slope will reach equilibrium when it reaches equilibrium, consuming whatever stands in its path until then. Official sources describe subsidence along the crown in the tens of meters, decentimetry. This is not cracking. This is not settling. This is wholesale vertical displacement of the ground surface, dropping entire neighborhoods by the height of multi-story buildings. Every measurement points to the same conclusion. A failure surface 35 meters deep, a front 4 kilometers wide. Oh, a scarp that must retreat from near vertical to 30 to 35 degrees. An ancient slide body reactivating along pre-existing planes of weakness. The geometry is unstable, the physics requires movement, and the retrogressive mechanism means each collapse enables the next. Roberto Troncarelli's statement that no technical solutions can guarantee definitive stabilization is not pessimism. It is engineering reality at this scale. The University of Turin's assessment was blunt. The phenomenon is molto esteso e difficilmente arrestabile, very extensive and difficult to arrest. The National Council of Geologists went further. No definitive stabilization solution exists. The strategic direction is not repair. It is delocalizazione, relocation. Reducing exposure rather than fixing the problem. Moving people rather than moving Earth. These statements represent a departure from the careful, hedged language officials typically use when disasters strike. They are admissions that the usual toolkit does not apply. And when you understand the engineering constraints, you understand why. Retaining walls cannot work because the failure surface extends 30 to 35 meters deep. A retaining wall functions by anchoring into stable ground below the sliding mass and providing resistance against movement. But at Niscemi, stable ground lies deeper than a 10-story building below the surface. A wall reaching that depth would need to resist the driving force of millions of cubic meters of moving material across a 4-kilometer front. The engineering is not difficult, it is physically impossible. No retaining wall system in existence can anchor below a 35-meter failure surface while resisting forces of this magnitude in an active urban setting. Drainage cannot work because the critical pore pressures are building in deep clay layers that take years to depressurize, not weeks. Drainage systems reduce landslide movement by lowering water pressure, removing the force that weakens clay and enables sliding. For shallow failures, this is effective. Wells and trenches can depressurize surface soils in months. But Niscemi's clay layers are 30 meters underground, fed by continuous infiltration through sandy upper layers and possibly decades of leaking urban infrastructure. Drainage cannot work fast enough, it cannot reach deep enough, and it cannot address an ancient slide body that has already reactivated along pre-existing slip surfaces. Regrading cannot work because you cannot reshape a slope while it is actively failing. Regrading, cutting back the slope to reduce its angle, is the most direct way to stabilize a failure. Remove material from the top, reduce the driving forces, let the slope find equilibrium. But regrading Niscemi would require removing massive volumes of material from an urban edge where buildings still stand, where ground is actively moving, where heavy equipment cannot safely operate. The volumes involved with a 4-kilometer front and 35-meter depth exceed any practical earth-moving operation, and the retrogressive mechanism means new material keeps becoming unstable as fast as old material could be removed. The official response has not been engineering intervention. It has been setbacks, a 150-meter safety zone from the scarp edge and relocation planning, not fixing the slope, accepting that it cannot be fixed. Fabio Siciliano, head of Italy's civil protection, captured the institutional conclusion in terms that left no room for false hope. Those on the landslide will not be able to return, not temporarily displaced, permanently relocated. The engineering impossibility has become policy. The physics has become planning. and the 1,800 evacuees waiting in shelters have become a census for a town that may never fully exist again. Physics does not negotiate. The scarp stands near vertical. The angle of repose for sandy material is 30 to 35 degrees. That gap must close. The only way it closes is through continued retrogression. The scarp retreating backward, consuming whatever stands in its path until the slope reaches equilibrium. This is not a prediction, it is geometry. The arithmetic is patient. It does not respond to emergency declarations or political promises, or the desperate hope of 1,800 people who want to return home. What makes this genuinely unprecedented is the recognition that Niscemi is experiencing the reactivation of an ancient failure. The slip surfaces being exploited today moved before, the same ground failing the same way, along the same planes of weakness. The landslide is not new, it is cyclical, and each cycle consumes more of the town than the last. Monitoring equipment installed across the slope continues recording displacement. Engineers search for deceleration signals that would indicate the failure is slowing, that the retrogression is stabilizing, that the physics might be approaching equilibrium. Those signals have not appeared. The red zone, initially 100 meters from the scarp edge, has already been extended to 150 meters. Civil protection operations continue. The evacuation count continues climbing, and the retrogression continues advancing toward the town center at rates that have not decreased since January 25th. In our next coverage, we will examine what the monitoring data actually shows, what the expansion predictions mean for thousands more residents still living within range of the advancing scarp, and why some geologists believe Niscemi may be just the most visible example of a problem affecting communities across Sicily and across Italy's 680,000 mapped landslides. The ground beneath Niscemi has moved before. It is moving now. And until the physics reaches equilibrium, it will keep moving, regardless of what anyone does to stop it.